Funding for the production of Folks is made possible in part by a grant from Union National Life Insurance, serving Louisiana and the South since 1926, a family-managed corporation providing whole life insurance.
Straight ahead on Folks, a look at two controversial races for the state Senate and the House in Baton Rouge. We'll meet the candidates involved. We'll also take a look at how the black vote influenced the recent statewide primary. Are black voters getting less predictable? We'll find out on today's edition of Folks. Hello everyone and welcome to Folks. I'm Sonya Masingale. The last 10 years have been some of the most politically interesting and productive for Black Louisiana. We've seen a number of firsts running and being elected to office, and we've seen how effectively the black vote can be used to make or break a candidate. But some experts are saying that black voters are not as predictable as they once were thought to be, and the past primary was full of surprises on both a local and state level. We're going to take a look at some of those surprises and their impact today. First, let's take a look at the House District 63 race between Kip Holden and Jewel Newman and the State Senate race, District 14, between Cleo Fields and Richard Turnley, here in Baton Rouge. In the past, black voters in these districts could be counted upon to support experienced incumbent candidates for office. But this year's election saw some big changes as both incumbents came in last. Jewel Newman has served the North Baton Rouge area for over 16 years, the past 4 as House Representative for District 63. He was defeated in this past election by 35-year-old law associate Kip Holden with a very large percentage of the vote. District 63, with a largely black population, has a reputation for loyalty in the past, but this election signals a change is occurring.
I think people want to change, and if you notice, we ran a clean campaign. I didn't call my opponent's name. I've never called my opponent's name in a campaign. I defeated 15 of them, including him. I never called a name. He said some things about us that we didn't get on the radio and count on him because we were the people we had helped, that we had logged in to come in this office, they signed in and they come in here. We didn't contact them on a personal basis or a person that even asked for support because we thought they knew what we had done for them. The people that go to Oak Long, that we had saved this hospital, we thought they knew it, but they heard some things out there and they took for granted. Plus, we had a low turnout. We only had 60% turnout. So some of the people that would have voted for us didn't go to the poll. And some of the ones that we thought could vote for us didn't vote for us. But time will only tell just how effective it would be because you don't walk in the shoes like that overnight.
How do you feel about leaving office at this time?
Well, after 16 years at a dedication to 24 hours a day, I should say, I think I need some rest. This is one way the Lord will tell me that I need some rest, and I can get some rest, and I just won't stop because help people, you help yourself. First, I served on a TAR board, that I would stay on that board. I served on an eye care board for youngsters on drug and alcohol. I was still on that board. And the Cancer Society, I would have to stay there because I've seen so many people that with cancer need help that I can help on that. The very special arts, so the handicapped kids on that I've been a part of that for a long time. I have to stick with that too, and I think I'll draw the line with it. With doing that and trying to find a job that would not be too confined and away from those things, I would do it. And when you help people, you help yourself. And it's a good thing when you help someone, that it's a consolation you have. And I don't take credit for doing those things by myself. It's the good Lord who helped me touch people that know someone to help those people that I'm able to call on.
If you had one piece of advice you could give to Mr. Holden, what would it be?
Don't talk so much. Stop and listen and pray. That would be my advice to him.
I think my prayers were answered when I defeated him, because I prayed constantly that I would get the guidance and direction to defeat him and the wisdom. at the same time to protect me against my enemies. Those were my constant and daily prayers. I think by talking so much, people know that they have a voice, and what that translated into was our slogan for this campaign. My slogan was, our voice, the voice of the people. When people hear you talking up for them, they know that you're not on the take. They know that you're not selling them out behind closed doors. They know that you're really looking out for their best interests. So in retrospect, I would say that maybe if I had to offer the advice to him in regards to his campaign, it would have been, if you would have spoken up more for the people, at least they probably would have come back in a greater fashion and form to give you some vote of confidence. Since you did not speak up for the people, then they chose to go with somebody who spoke up for them in an overwhelming manner.
Kip Holden, the young city councilman who defeated Newman in the House District 63 race, responds to advice from his predecessor. Holden does share Newman's opinion that age had little to do with his victory.
I think really the spirit of being straightforward with the people. I think I have set forth a record that shows them that, number one, I'm a no-nonsense politician. I do not believe in selling the people out that I represent, that I believe in speaking up for the people that I represent, and that when it comes down to a true issue between the community or favoring some politicians, I will favor the community, because I firmly believe those individuals are responsible for me being in public office. They are really my boss. Taking that into consideration, then you look at somebody who's been in office for a number of years, then understanding the fact that if you refuse to address the issues that concern the people in your district, then you have some problems. For example, in the area of education, we cannot have anybody representing us that votes for budget cuts in education. For health care for the elderly and poor, we cannot have somebody in office that's going to vote for budget cuts in health care. Those are some very crucial issues to us. When it comes to jobs, we cannot have somebody who says, well, it's who you know instead of what you know.
Perhaps one of the biggest surprises for black voters in the October primary was the defeat of Baton Rouge District 14 Senator Richard Turnley, an incumbent with 16 years of experience, by 24-year-old Cleo Fields, a recent graduate of the Southern University Law Center. Turnley, who helped establish the 14th District Senate seat, lost to Fields by a slim margin of about 200 votes.
There were a lot of individuals that were really seeking some change. And of course, quite a few of us got swept up in that whole process. I think there were my voters who were apathetic about my winning, and of course thought that I would, and felt that I didn't need a whole lot of help, and I either stayed home or went to the game and really didn't vote. However, I don't think it's a mandate. You know, I only lost by 200 and a few votes, and so therefore receiving 50% of the vote, I feel very comfortable with the fact that it wasn't really throw the rascal out, you know, he wasn't doing his job, we don't need him, and this type of thing. I think the factors are there that clearly indicate that had it not been for those few things that did happen, that we would have been a winner.
If you had one piece of advice to give your successor, what would it be?
I would have to think that our constituency is a very diverse group of individuals who are working men and women that have had the benefit of a person who has been independent and could make independent decisions. My advice would be to keep it that way and not be controlled by some special interest groups who will not have our best interests at heart. I think that that is the most important asset that a public official can have, and that is to be independent.
Many voters remember young Cleo Fields from his statewide effort to register voters back in the early 80s. His ability to organize and motivate people of all ages was apparent even then. Now he stands as one of the youngest state senators in the United States. What factors helped him to defeat Turnley?
Prayers and a lot of help from the community. We started off with about 350 volunteers. People put a put a lot into the campaign. So without any question, without people going to the polls, voting their conviction, and supporting the campaign helped me win. When we first started out, a lot of people didn't believe we could win. Of course, we had a lot of proving to do. We had to get across two obstacles, age and experience. And those were two high hurdles to cross, because many people in the district felt we were too young and we were too inexperienced. And the way we dealt with both issues, we asked what was the right age according to the Constitution, Article 4, I think subsection 3. Anyone of age 18 that lives in the state for 2 years and within a particular district for 1 year could run for state legislature. And it wasn't the right age, but it was the right attitude. So we dealt with the attitude perspective and not the age perspective.
What's first on the agenda for District 14?
Well, one of the first things that we're going to have to do, and one of the things that we're doing now, and that is organizing a district-wide council. This council will give people the input, some input in terms of making decisions or in the decision-making process. I think all too often we've left the public out, our constituents out, in terms of getting some feedback from them as to how they feel about a given situation. But we're going to organize a district-wide council. This council will be informed on a monthly basis as to my feelings and views of legislative issues, and I would also get their input. Also, we're going to form task force. We talk about problems that we have in education, and we're going to form task force, and we're going to deal with the problems in education. Talk about problems that we have with the lack of jobs. We're going to form task force to bring about a strong economic development program for District 14, the environment, juvenile delinquency. So the bottom line is we're going to have task force. We're going to have an organized body that's going to be working on a monthly basis, actually a daily basis, solving the many problems that we face. I cannot solve the problems alone. It's time for us to include people, and I'm willing to do that, and I'm ready to do it, and we're doing it now.
What kind of help or advice will you be looking for from the incumbent?
I think we're going to have to come together as a district to work hand in hand to solve our problems. I'm looking at this race from the perspective that everybody in District 14 voted for Cleo Fields, therefore have no access to grind. We all are friends, and we must come together. I'm going to be looking for advice from the incumbent. I'm going to be looking for his input and for his participation in the overall program. We cannot afford to start singling out our people. When I say our people, I'm speaking in terms of the constituency of District 14. And I'm not going to work with a select group of people. I'm going to work with all of the people.
Can black voters be counted on to vote along racial lines? And how did black voters influence the outcome of the recent state primary? Joining me in the studio to take a look at these questions and more is Mr. Frank Ransburg, Director of Planning in the Division of Student Affairs at Southern. He's also an instructor in Louisiana history and political science. Also, Dr. Wayne Parent, an Associate Professor of Political Science at LSU here in Baton Rouge, and he teaches Louisiana politics and elections. Welcome to folks. Mr. Ransburg, can black voters be counted upon to vote along racial and party lines now?
I think to a large extent blacks vote along party lines. However, I think election results will show that when I say along party lines, I mean primarily blacks vote with the Democratic Party. But if a person of another party, particularly the Republican Party, shows that he does care for the aspirations and desires and the needs of blacks, blacks will vote for that person. A good example of that would be the recent election for sheriff in East Baton Rouge Parish. 4 years ago, Elmer Litchfield got very little black vote, but in the recent elections, the preliminary figures I have seen suggest that Elmer Litchfield got in excess of 70% of the black vote. And Elmer Litchfield is a Republican, and his opponent ran as a Democrat, and on all of his signs showed that he was a Democrat. So I think blacks have historically voted Democratic, but to some extent, blacks are voting for the man rather than the party. Or let me hasten to say, Sonya, for the lady rather than the party.
Dr. Parent, what role did the black vote play in the recent gubernatorial primary?
Well, blacks, I think, had a lot to do with Bob Livingston not being in the runoff, oddly enough. I mean, most people sort of expected Livingston to make the runoff with Edwards. I think there was a fear that a Republican would be fairly divisive because Republicans have historically, especially at the higher levels, and the Litchfield example is a good example of at the lower levels it works a little differently, but Republicans have had problems with blacks in the higher levels. The Hinson-Moore problem with taking blacks off the rolls, and Reagan and Bork. Those are real divisions that the Republicans have yet to heal with blacks in Louisiana. And I think there are a lot of people in Louisiana recognizing black political power and sympathizing with black desires that really were willing to vote for a conservative, willing to vote for a reform candidate, but not quite willing to vote for a Republican right now. And I think, frankly, blacks had a lot to do with Bob Livingston not making the runoff, because he was sort of the logical choice. He was that number 2. He was on the other side of Edwards. He was his enemy, and people were sort of thinking of a reform to Edwards. So,
okay,
yeah.
Let me ask you this. Did the abundance of Democrats in the race cause a significant split among the black voters?
Well, in the early parts, yes, but it seemed that the figures that I've seen that blacks sort of went home to Edwin Edwards toward the end, when it looked like Billy Tozan and Jim Brown's campaigns were sort of falling down. There was significant movement to Tozan and Brown, not so much Romer, but to Tozan and Brown early on among the black electorate. But the black electorate is fairly sophisticated and realized when Tozan and Brown were going to fall down that Edwards was the logical choice. So I think black vote was fairly split in the beginning, but when Tozan and Brown appeared very clearly that they were not going to make the runoff, went on home to Edwin Edwards.
Mr. Ransburg, I see you shaking your head. You definitely agree that that's what happened in the past primary?
Well, the past primary, if you're looking at classical primaries in Louisiana politics, the last primary was not a crowded primary. If you go back to 1971 when Edwards first ran, and at that time you had a Democratic primary, a Democratic second primary, and then the Democrat ran against the Republican in a general election the next year in '72. In the Democratic primary of 1971, there were 17 Democrats in the primary, including the likes of Edwin Edwards, Benny Johnston, Gillis Long, and all of these people. So you had quite a spread of the black vote, and you had a black candidate, Sam Bell, in that 1971 primary. So you had a large number of candidates acceptable to blacks, which caused a greater spread in the black vote than you would have when you have basically 5 major candidates in 1987, which would compact the spread.
Was the number of black voters significantly lower than it has been in past elections?
The figures that we've looked at suggest that 60% of the black registered voters went to the polls in 1987. Now, as of June 30th, there were 560,000 black registered voters in the state. With 60% going to the polls, you're talking roughly close to 300,000 going to the polls on October 24th.
So is that more or less?
That's down somewhat.
That is down.
That's down. A Shreveport analyst, I believe, said that as of Thursday, before the election, as of October 22nd, 43% of the black vote was still undecided. That's 48 hours before the election. And if voters are still undecided, that high percentage is undecided, 48 hours before the election, I think the word undecided and apathy might be being used somewhat interchangeably here, because that is a high number of voters to be undecided that close to an election, which suggests usually the implication is, the inference is that we don't want the incumbent, but we haven't decided which of the other candidates we do want.
We know that after Reconstruction in Louisiana, PBS Pinchback was the first black governor of Louisiana. He didn't stay governor very long, but the black voters definitely had a role in that. In the past 20 or so years, what role has the black vote played in Louisiana politics?
Well, if you go back 20 years would be 1967. I think the classical case would be to go back to 1963, where at that time you still had the Democratic primary and then the general election with the Republican. The 2 major candidates in that 1963 election were Public Service Commissioner John McKithen and New Orleans Mayor Delipsis Morrison. Of course, Morrison finished first in the Democratic primary and received a heavy black vote. At that time, you had far less than the 500,000 blacks that you have registered now. McKithen won the runoff with Morrison, and it was such a bitter race, and the racial question did enter the picture until in the spring of 1964, the Republican candidate, Carlton Lyons, received 38% of the vote in the general election, which at that time was a substantial vote for a Republican to receive in Louisiana, especially when you had the newspaper editors making such statements as the Republican Party could call a meeting in a telephone booth. That's just how small the Republican vote was in the state at that time. But the black vote has been increased since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which guarantees blacks the right to vote, and it has helped many candidates get elected who otherwise could not have gotten elected.
Mr. Parent, you want to jump in there?
It's interesting when you jump back to the 60s, you realize the appeal of Edwards and why blacks were still voting for Edwin Edwards, because really the end of the era of black support, meaning losing, which is what happened with Chet Morrison. Chet Morrison was a strong candidate, but there was still those intense racial conflicts. 1971 changed all that when Edwin Edwards won with the black vote. And once Edwin Edwards came in, he really supported blacks, put blacks in prominent positions. And even in 1987, it's tough for blacks to forget that. And Edwin Edwards, even though he's been through trials and things like that, has been a friend of blacks for a good 15 years. And Edwin Edwards got a lot of loyal support. I see Edwards in some ways similar to John Kennedy in the sense that Edwin Edwards was the first candidate to really bring blacks into the political mainstream. And when blacks sort of saw that there was Tozan and Brown who didn't have much of a chance, Edwards was a logical choice because Edwards was a proven commodity, someone who had supported blacks all along. 71 really changed that when Edwards won with black support, and then we started seeing a lot of candidates. John Breaux is a perfect example of winning with black support, and that black support really meaning things. We saw the Judge Bork thing. I mean, black support had everything to do with he and Bennett Johnson's vote.
In the local races, particularly House District 63 here in Baton Rouge and the Senate District 14, much younger men led all the way in those particular races. Is that signaling a trend among black voters for a younger leadership? Are we looking at younger candidates?
I think you're looking at younger candidates. I also think that blacks have been an important part of politics for 20 years now, a very important part of politics. You're right, I mean, the Voting Rights Act of 65 doubled black strength in Louisiana, made a very important component. And blacks now have a lot more information. There aren't those 2 or 3 voter leagues. There's several voter leagues. And now that there's a lot more competition out there, and I just think that was an indication that with a lot of different information, Richard Turnley, Senator Turnley, his voter league is not the only source of information now. I think it's a signal that there's a lot of competition in the black community now, and you would expect that after 20 years of strength. Early on, when blacks were new to politics, you only had 2 or 3 people out there. Now there's a lot of people out there, and you're getting these very competitive races, and that's what you see, a lot of good people running, like the mayor's race in New Orleans, and some of the older people are just going to lose because there's real tough competition out there.
Would you agree with that trend, Mr. Ransburg?
To some extent I would, but in looking at District 63, unlike maybe across the state, District 63 had an issue-oriented campaign. I think the main issue being the environmental thing. As you know, District 63 is located in the heart of the chemical plants and these types of things. And I think Mr. Holden effectively made an issue, or made his case before the people of that district. And I think it paid off for him in the election.
Okay. On a statewide level, there are still no black congressmen or senators representing the state in Washington, and there are still no black state elected officials. What is it going to take to move blacks into that particular mainstream?
We had an excellent opportunity to get a black into, at least into a runoff, but we failed this time in the person of Edwin Lombard, the clerk of court in Orleans Parish, who was eminently qualified and received the endorsement of several major newspapers, including the Shreveport Journal. It is just difficult to get a black elected statewide, especially when we talk about blacks voting along racial lines, when whites have a tendency to vote along racial lines also.
That's a very important point when it comes to congressmen, because there is a majority black district in New Orleans that Lindy Boggs represents.
Yes.
Now, when people talk about voting along racial lines, she's run against fairly prominent black politicians, but she has supported blacks, and blacks have crossed over and voted for a white congressperson in the case of our senior congressman, Lindy Boggs. Now, when Lindy Boggs retires, and there's always speculation, every 2 years there's speculation that Lindy Boggs retires, I think we can bank on the fact that she'll be replaced by a black congressman from that district. And so that's the soon, you know, that's the quick one. That's the one that's most likely to happen. But I agree with you. Once an Ed Lombard gets into the runoff, I think the possibilities are there. It happened in Virginia a couple years ago. They have a black lieutenant governor, and
It happened recently in Mississippi.
it happened in Mississippi, and we're going to see
With
that
the
sort of
SB.
thing happen. Yeah.
In the near future. Okay, finally, does the concession of Governor Edwards, the last of the traditional Louisiana politicians, mean that there is a true political revolution taking place in Louisiana?
I think we'll have to wait some time to get an assessment of that. I know there were those who said in 1979, when Dave Treen was elected, that we would have a Republican governor for the next 20 years. All the sheriffs, the clerks of court, the police jurors would change their party affiliation to Republican, and that the Republicans would dominate Louisiana politics. That did not happen. I think we'll have to wait to see just how things go before we make that assessment.
Yeah, I think it'll have a lot to do with Buddy Roemer's second and third year in office to see if he can reach out and broaden his constituency. He started out with 33% of the vote, actually, and a lot of the Republican conservative vote. But once he broadens beyond, if he broadens beyond his very conservative base, you could see a bit of a revolution going on there. Otherwise, he might not get reelected, and we wouldn't call that a revolution.
No, we wouldn't. We're out of time for today. I want to thank both of you, and best of luck with your future endeavors.
Good to be here.
Thank you for being here today, and be sure to join us next week for another edition of Folks. Bye-bye.
Funding for the production of Folks is made possible in part by a grant from Union National Life Insurance, serving Louisiana and the South since 1926, a family-managed corporation providing whole life insurance.